Haroon Siddiqui, I want you to pick up on that because, we shouldn't really always draw comparisons, but it's kind of obvious with the new administration here how the Trump administration have been addressing the threat of terrorism with the partial travel ban from mostly Muslim countries, even though most attacks happen domestically and haven't happened for those countries. We know the facts. Do you see a distinction here between how the UK and the US and other countries deal with this?
No, I think when you question that and when Sean is talking and so on, we are splitting hair here. We need to rise above these details and so on. This idea that it's the mullahs who are creating it, it's the madrasas who are creating it, it's the Wahhabis who are creating. Why don't we talk some reality? All of this talk is divorced from the reality. If it was Islam, if it was Wahhabism, if it was all the mullahs and madrasas, why hasn't this been happening for the last 1600 years? It has happened in history once in a while. But this modern form of jihadism, radicalism, terrorism is a very modern phenomenon for the last 10 or 15 years. Why is this happening only now? Islam has been around for 1600 years.
David, I want to bring David in here because he's disagreeing with you. David?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about Wahhabism,
yes.
right, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab wasn't alive at the foundation of Islam 1400 years ago. And also, if you look at the history of Wahhabism, it engaged almost immediately in wars of conquest, drastic slaughter of Shias, and that has been part and parcel of the history of that particular sect, as you well know.
Haroon?
But this is total diversion. Why is this happening in the West, in the United States, in Europe in the last 15 years? And nobody's answering that question.
What is the answer?
It is happening because of the American wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. That's what's happening here.
That begs the question. I mean, if you're saying it's because
and
of the war
wants
in Iraq,
to talk about this
and you
reality.
say that the 9/11 attacks happened because of the war in Iraq, then you're using a time machine.
No, 9/11 happened.
That's not.
No, 9/11 happened.
Well,
9/11
that's a very good point.
because of American foreign policies.
Raza Rumi.
So ideology is irrelevant, is your argument. Ideology makes no difference at all.
I'd like to pick up on this point.
Raza,
I
yes.
think there are. Yes,
please.
I mean, I actually would like to agree with Haroon largely because we often overlook the impact of a militarized foreign policy that the UK and the US have pursued in the last 10, 15 years. In particular, when Tony Blair has apologized and when the world knows that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and despite that, bombing was done and hundreds and thousands of Iraqis have lost their lives. Same is happening in Syria as we speak. Somewhere in Yemen, bombs are being dropped and they are largely sold by the West to Saudi Arabia, and there are countries which are banned as potentially terrorist countries, but Saudi Arabia is feted and dined and wined with. And the question is that we all know Wahhabism comes from the Saudi lands. Why are the Western governments still very close allies of Saudi Arabia? I mean, I don't believe in sanctions or bombs. By the way, these tools don't really work. But the question is, at least for the sake of cutting down the hypocrisy, Western governments have to tell Saudi Arabia, their close ally, that this is not on. Most of the madrasas across the Islamic world have been financed by Saudi money, and they promote a particular ideology. In my country, Pakistan, where I come from, 70,000 people have died in the last decade or so. And, partly it's due to war on terror, the geography, but partly that there are all these seminaries which preach hatred, which otherize non-Muslims or Shias or whatever. And we have to now, confront this whole bogey of jihadism, because in the 80s it was started for Afghanistan. It has continued, and now it's become a global threat. And still we see in Syria that there are good jihadis and bad jihadis. Sometimes the US is financing someone else. And so we need to really clarify these issues.
Thanks, gentlemen, for that. I just want to bring in Sean here and move the discussion on a bit. You talked about this new type of terrorism. Explain what you mean.
Well, I mean, it's low tech. It's suicidal or semi-suicidal, and it's quite indiscriminate.
Yes.
It's not so much about assassinating political leaders. It's not even bombs anymore. You don't need the equipment. You don't need elaborate plans. You don't need cells necessarily. You don't need to get your hands on guns and firearms. A kitchen knife and a car is all that was required in London yesterday. And I dare say it will happen again. In fact, I'm rather surprised it hasn't happened rather more than it has done so far. Yeah. So for us in the West and in England, it is a novel thing. I think over in the Middle East and Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, they've had car bombs, they've had suicide bombs, they've had much, much more experience of it, I'm afraid, and at much greater cost of life too. And going back to what your other contributors were saying, it's perfectly true that the Western interventions did not help the situation. But anyway, that's the new thing that we've got. And, you know, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, said, he may have been misquoted or out of context, but words to the effect that people who live in big cities like London have to get more used to the idea of this sort of terrorism. David, and I'm afraid that's true.
David,
no.
Hang on a second. I want to bring David in here.
The war on terror. It just happens to be true.
David, can I bring you in?
No, that's not what Sadiq Khan said. You know, just let's clarify this. Sure. We don't want to leave that uncontested. Sadiq Khan did not say we get used to terrorism and so on. What he said was we need to get used to the idea that we have to support the security systems, the intelligence officers and the police people who have to deal with these in big cities. So he, in fact, like Donald Trump Jr. was completely mischaracterizing what this poor man said in London.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about Trump family tweets. We talk about that often enough. David, can I bring you in here? Is this new type of terrorism where you just use a car and a knife as a weapon, no hostage taking, no demands, just death?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's...
And not linked to ISIL?
we don't know one way or the other. You know, ISIS has described him as a soldier of the caliphate. In the past, you'll have a lot of attacks which were described originally as lone wolf and turned out not to be. You know, for example, you had a couple of attacks in Germany, the Ansbach attack being one where initially there was a rush to call it lone wolf, and then almost within 2 days, ISIS was able to release martyrdom tape. So in this case, let's wait and see. The model that has been used for a lot of these attacks has been what I call the virtual planner model, in which you basically have an individual sitting in Syria who plays the role that an old physical recruitment network would play. Online, right. Okay. And in this case, look, this is someone who, again, 52 years old. He's not really the target demographic for someone who's active on social media, but he could have had encrypted communications. And at the very least, urging people on to carry out attacks, and sometimes providing them with technical assistance, even sometimes crude technical assistance. In Würzburg, when you had an attacker on a train, it was a knife attack inspired by ISIS. Initially, the virtual planner who he was in touch with tried to get him to do a car attack, similar to the one that we saw in London. And the attacker said, well, you know, I don't have a driver's license. In Germany, it costs about 1,500 euros to get a driver's license. It's a very intensive process. But this is the role that they play. And so the network can often have hands where we don't see it at first.
That's very interesting because as we've seen less foreign fighters flow into Syria and Iraq, we have seen communications from ISIL saying, hey, take it upon yourselves in these countries, you know, you need a knife or a car or a bat. And this is a good segue because we had the ISIL meeting here in Washington as this attack happened. The British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson was actually at the State Department. I was there. Let me just play you a clip from Rex Tillerson, the new US Secretary of State, about this sort of strategy that they say they have.
Degradation of ISIS is not the end goal. We must defeat ISIS. I recognize there are many pressing challenges in the Middle East, but defeating ISIS is the United States' #1 goal in the region. As we've said before, when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. We must continue to keep our focus on the most urgent matter at hand.
Haroon Siddiqui, your reaction to that? Is there a new Trump strategy dealing with ISIL, considering he said there was in a campaign, a secret one, I seem to remember?
I mean, this is such a horrible thing to say, but we've been hearing this for the last 16 years. We are going to win, we are going to liberate, we are going to do this, we are going to grind them into dust. We have been hearing this for 16 years. ISIS is a creation of the war in Iraq. If we want to, everyone wants to sound Churchillian, you know, we are going to do this, we are going to win this. When are we going to win it? We have been hearing it for 16 years now. Why don't we look at the obvious? end the wars on Muslim nations and Muslims there, one, and stop the cultural warfare on Muslims here, number two. Number three, don't have a hierarchy of deaths. 4 people, 5 people dead in England, horrible thing. 6 died, 6 Muslims were killed in Quebec City. Tens of thousands die in terrorism attacks across the world. Raza, whom we are talking to, is a victim of that kind of ideology and jihadism, but we don't care about that. We don't talk about those things. So we live in an unreal world, you know. We need to get real about these things.
Raza, you're nodding. What can you add? And I just want to throw in here that the US has talked about maybe creating some sort of safe zones that was floated before in Syria for refugees. They've talked about upping aid to the Kurds and others to take on ISIL, even cooperating, of course, with Assad's government in Damascus. Do you see any of this bearing any more fruit, considering Mosul battles going on now, and that's pretty tough?
No, I think the military strategy has had its impact in Iraq, but you know, that's a short-term stopgap arrangement. The real need is for the Western nations to honestly reflect on what has gone wrong, because we heard the similar rhetoric against Al-Qaeda. And is Al-Qaeda finished? Has it been, done to dust? It is very much alive. 3 states, Syria, Libya, and Iraq, as we speak, have been decimated, have turned into these, ungoverned spaces, ideal for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So it is time to for an honest reflection, because this bravado alone is not enough. Yet, at the same time, I would also say that within Muslim countries, there are Muslim clerics, there are seminaries, there are hate materials that also need to be tailored and corrected, because it's after all something that Muslims also have to own.
David?
I'd also add Yemen and Somalia and Mali to the list of countries that have been decimated that he provided. I think that both are correct. I think that Reza articulates very well the need for both reflection, but also one thing I would point out is that the U.S. intervention, while I'm very critical of how it went down, I think it creates the stage for another militant takeover. It actually saved a great deal of lives at the outset. Right? ISIS was engaged in a genocide at the time against the Yazidis. Right? That was one of the key reasons that the U.S.
That was the red line that led,
And the U.S. did save a lot of lives in going in. So military interventions are ambiguous things.
It saved a lot of lives after 1 million people were dead in Iraq.
Look, we understand that history, and I don't disagree with that history as a critic of.
For God's sake.
So, as a critic of the Iraq War, I don't disagree with that. But to simply take the side that any U.S. intervention is wrong. My point is that in addition to U.S. intervention doing things that are negative, like in this case, saving tens of thousands of Yazidi lives was in fact a positive thing. Understanding that ambiguity, understanding the way that it can work in different ways is important. And you don't need to talk over me, because it's not helping you to try to talk over me.
Please,
look,
you've had your say.
I mean, look.
It would be more
Haroon,
credible
please.
if he had spoken up when
Why
a
in the
million
world
lives
do you
were
think
lost.
you gained something from
It's okay.
talking over me? Like, I was talking.
Okay.
We can take turns.
Okay, David.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think we've got your point. What I'd actually like to finish the show on is actually in London. Sorry to cut you both off, but Sean O'Grady, you're there in London. What do you think we can expect the reactions to be in the coming days following this attack? And what do you think it's taught us, even though this has only been 24, 48 hours since then?
Well, I just repeat that I think the reactions have been good on the whole. And I think that the idea of this sort of war of civilizations, or religious war, or ethnic war, whatever it is that these people want to do, has not materialized, and it will not materialize either. But that doesn't mean that they'll go away, or that they've, in that sense, been defeated. I think defeating them is a very, as Rex Tillerson was suggesting, is a very difficult, a very hard aim indeed, because you can't negotiate with them. You can't, even if you got Islamic State, so-called, and Al-Qaeda to agree to some peaceable compromise in some sense somewhere, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't have hate preachers and and
I totally
other
get it, Sean.
organisations
Sorry,
coming
guys.
along to outflank them and start another war.
Sorry, guys, we've totally run out of time. Very stimulating discussion. We'll have you back soon. That's all we have time for on The Heat. Join us on the next episode of The Heat, our weekly Reporters Roundtable. We'll analyse the world's biggest stories, including this one. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us.